One of the key elements when working with OCAPI is understanding how to construct the URL for requests. OCAPI has a specific URL format that we need to follow with a well-defined syntax, which allows us to specify the type of API we're calling, the instance we're targeting, and the resource we're requesting. Looking at the official Salesforce documentation on the screen, we can see that the URL is composed of two parts, the base URL and the extended URL. The base URL, as shown, follows a specific syntax, https://dh/ap type. Let's break this down. First, it's important to differentiate between environments that have an alias develop, such as production or development. Since accessing through a direct production URL, production eu01.demandware.net, you would use the alias. Imagine we're working on the Adidas website. The URL would be https://adidas.com// followed by the site identifier you're making the request to. For example, the URL could look like adidas.com/refarch. Here, refarch is the site where we want to retrieve information. After this, we add the DW component, which stands for demandware. This is mandatory. And finally, we specify the type of API we want to access, such as Shop API. As we've discussed in previous sections, there are three main types of APIs: Shop API, Data API, and Meta API. Depending on what you need, you would choose Shop, Data, or Meta. Thus, the base URL is indicating that we want to access the production environment, in this case, adidas.com, the site refarch, using the Shop API. If no alias is available, you would need to use the direct URL of your instance. For example, if you are working in the development environment, the URL might refer to a sandbox instance, and you would specify the type of API and the site in the same way. It's also important to note that when using the Data API, it doesn't reference any specific site, so in place of a site name, a hyphen is used. The second part of constructing the API URL is the extended URL, where we define the specific version of the API we want to use, the endpoint we're requesting, and the resource we're targeting. Additionally, there are many optional features we can append to the URL to filter the data according to our needs. I mentioned earlier the concept of OCAPI versions. What does this mean? Well, OCAPI has different versions, as you can see in the documentation, such as version 24.5, 24.4, etc. How do versions work in Commerce Cloud? Each version may introduce new endpoints, deprecate older ones, or add new resources. So depending on the data we need, we select the appropriate version of the API. Specifically, we tell OCAPI which version to use for the request, and then we specify which resource, the endpoint, we're requesting. For example, in the documentation, you'll find various resources like baskets, categories, content, custom objects, folders, and so on. For this example, I've opened the content section where we can see how the URL is constructed. This is what we've covered so far, the base URL and the extended URL. In this case, we're using version 24.5 of OCAPI, accessing the content, and the last part of the URL specifies the particular content we want to retrieve via OCAPI. For example, in the URL for a request in development using the Shop API against the site refarch and OCAPI version 24.5, we might request a resource named cookie policy. If we have successfully authenticated using our client ID, we will have the necessary security options. It's likely that the URL will require the client ID as a parameter. By including this, the API will respond with the data for the requested resource.